By 1945, Adolf Hitler was a junkie. The leader of the master race rarely left his bed without a lethal injection of Eukodal, animal organs, and high-grade crystal meth. The Blitzkrieg may have started on gasoline, but the Nazi war machine ended on the chemicals pumping through the Führer's veins. Born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, Hitler was the product of a genetic and psychological pressure cooker. The pathology of the addict was forged in the childhood of the boy. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official, a man of rigid bureaucracy, short temper, and violence. Alois was a heavy drinker who ruled his household with a terrifying unpredictability. He communicated with his son through shouting and beatings. Young Adolf learned early on that the world was a place of brute force, where the strong dominated the weak, and where authority was absolute and terrifying. On the other side of this equation was his mother, Clara. If Alois was the source of terror, Clara was the source of a suffocating, almost pathological devotion. Having lost 3 previous children to illness, she poured all her anxiety and love into Adolf. She coddled him, worshipped him, and instilled in him a belief that he was special, unique, and destined for greatness. This polarizing dynamic, the fear of the father and the worship of the mother, created a classic narcissistic fissure in his personality. He developed a grandiose sense of self-importance to protect himself from the reality of his father's abuse. He learned to retreat into a fantasy world where he was the master, the artist, the genius whom the world simply hadn't recognized yet. This fragility was exposed when he moved to Vienna in 1907. He carried with him the conviction that he was a great artist. When the Academy of Fine Arts rejected him, not once but twice, it didn't just bruise his ego, it shattered his reality. A healthy mind processes failure, adapts, and moves on. Hitler's mind did not. He drifted into the homeless shelters of Vienna, a down-and-out drifter selling postcards, eating in soup kitchens, and stewing in a toxic brew of resentment. It was here, in the flophouses of Vienna, that he began to construct a shield against his own inadequacy. He didn't fail because he lacked talent. He failed because of them. The Jews, the Marxists, the establishment. He externalized his internal pain. But beneath the growing layers of hatred was a nervous system that was fundamentally weak, prone to collapse under pressure, and desperate for an external source of strength. He was a man waiting for a crutch. The First World War gave Hitler a purpose, but it also provided the first clinical proof of his psychological instability. For 4 years, he served as a dispatch runner, surviving the carnage of the Western Front. He thrived in the chaos because the army gave him the structure his father had once provided, but without the personal abuse. However, the breaking point came in October 1918 near the Belgian town of Wervik. During a British mustard gas attack, Hitler was partially exposed. He was evacuated to the Passewalk Military Hospital in Pomerania. The physical effects of the gas were painful, swollen eyelids, respiratory distress, but they were generally survivable and temporary. Yet something strange happened in that hospital ward. While his physical eyes were healing, Hitler went completely blind. He claimed he could see nothing but glowing coals. Crucially, when the doctors examined his eyes, they found no structural damage to the corneas or the optic nerves that could explain the total loss of vision. The eyes were capable of seeing, but the brain was refusing to process the images. The chief psychiatrist at Passewalk, Dr. Edmund Forster, diagnosed him with hysterical blindness. In modern medical terms, this is a conversion disorder, a condition where extreme psychological distress converts into physical symptoms. The trigger for this blindness wasn't just the gas, It was the news that Germany had surrendered. The Kaiser had abdicated. The war was lost. For Hitler, whose entire identity was now fused with the German army, this reality was too traumatic to process. So, his body simply shut down. He went blind because he could not bear to see the defeat. This forensic detail reveals that long before he met his demon doctor, Hitler possessed a somatic nervous system, a body that reacted violently to psychological stress. When the world became too much, he didn't just get stressed, he got sick. He collapsed. This history of hysterical reaction is the key that unlocks his later addiction. It shows us a man who was not made of iron but of glass, constantly terrified of shattering, and who would eventually require a chemical adhesive to hold himself together. Decades later, specifically by the mid-1930s, that glue began to dissolve. Although Hitler stood as the Chancellor of Germany, having dismantled the Weimar Republic to establish a dictatorship, to the outside world, he is the picture of vitality. The propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, crafts an image of the Führer as an ascetic monk, a man who does not smoke, does not drink, eats no meat, and dedicates every ounce of his energy to the fatherland. He is presented as a man who needs no comfort, no luxury, and certainly no medicine. But behind the heavy curtains of the Reich Chancellery, the reality was pathetic and painful. By 1936, Hitler was suffering from severe, chronic gastrointestinal distress. He was plagued by uncontrollable stomach cramps that would leave him doubled over in agony after meals. He suffered from alternating constipation and diarrhea, and perhaps most humiliating for a man obsessed with dignity, he suffered from extreme meteorism, severe, uncontrollable flatulence. For a dictator who believed himself a demigod, the psychological toll was devastating. He was terrified to sit through a state dinner or a high-level briefing for fear of a humiliating bodily function. He became socially withdrawn. He began to limit his diet even further, eating only mashed vegetables and strange concoctions, which only made the digestion worse. He also developed severe eczema on his legs, itchy, weeping sores that he bandaged and hid beneath his trousers. He was unable to sleep, pacing his room until dawn. The medical elite of Germany, the top SS doctors like Dr. Karl Brandt, examined him. They were men of science, rigorous and academic. They told him to change his diet, to rest, to reduce stress. They offered slow, sensible cures. But Hitler didn't want sensible. He didn't want slow. He was a man who believed in the triumph of the will, in lightning wars, in immediate results. He wanted a cure that worked as fast as a tank division breaking through a defensive line. He was a desperate patient looking for a miracle. And in the underworld of Berlin's high society medicine, there was a man who specialized in selling exactly that. The man who answered this call was Theodor Morell, a physician who was the living antithesis of the Nazi aesthetic, representing everything the regime despised. He was obese, with a protruding belly that strained the buttons of his waistcoat. He had thick, hairy hands, dark complexion, and by all accounts he practiced questionable hygiene. Those who stood near him often complained of a distinct, unpleasant body odor. He wheezed when he walked. He was not the blond, blue-eyed, athletic Aryan ideal. Professionally, he was even more of an outcast. Morell ran a private practice on the Kurfürstendamm, Berlin's fashionable boulevard. He was not a researcher or a surgeon. He was a vitamin stasser, a vitamin pusher. He had made a fortune treating society ladies, actresses, and wealthy businessmen for vague ailments like exhaustion or nerves. His methods were controversial. He didn't believe in waiting for the body to heal. He believed in the needle. He injected his patients with strange concoctions of bacteria, glucose, and animal proteins. The mainstream medical establishment viewed him as a quack, a charlatan who used the placebo effect and mild stimulants to keep his wealthy clients coming back. They called him the Reich injection master behind his back, a mockery of his tendency to solve every problem with a syringe. But Morell had one quality that Hitler prized above all else. He never said no, and he never said impossible. The meeting that changed history happened in 1936 at a dinner party at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. Hitler was in agony. His stomach was cramping. He was sweating. He was miserable. He had retreated to a corner, unable to eat. Morell, who had been invited through a mutual acquaintance, saw his opening. He approached the Führer not with medical jargon, but with a promise. He told Hitler that he had a treatment, a secret culture of intestinal bacteria called Mutaflor. It was essentially a strain of E. coli harvested from the stool of a healthy soldier, encased in capsules that would survive the stomach acid and repopulate the gut. But more importantly, Morell promised immediate relief. He didn't tell Hitler to sleep more or eat less. He said, "I can fix this now." Hitler, desperate and in pain, agreed to try. He took the Mutaflor. Whether it was the biology of the bacteria or the sheer power of the placebo effect acting on his hysterical nature, the result was miraculous. The cramps subsided. The bloating went down. For the first time in years, Hitler felt comfortable in his own skin. To Hitler, this was not just medicine. It was magic. He looked at Morell and saw a genius whom the establishment had unfairly rejected, just as the Art Academy had rejected him. He saw a kindred spirit. He immediately appointed Morell as his personal physician, granting him a position of power that would soon rival the top generals of the Wehrmacht. But Mutaflor was just the handshake. Once Morell was inside the inner circle, the treatment evolved. Hitler complained of fatigue. Morell had a needle for that, a shot of 20% glucose solution injected directly into the vein for an instant sugar rush. Hitler felt a cold coming on. Morell had a shot for that, vitamins, calcium, and liver extracts. Throughout 1937, the ritual was established. Every morning, the patient A would roll up his sleeve. The fat, hairy hands of the doctor would find the vein. The glass plunger would go down, and the Führer would rise, artificially energized, ready to face the world. At this stage, the drugs were relatively benign, mostly sugars, vitamins, and gut bacteria. There were no hard narcotics yet, but the psychological threshold had been crossed. Hitler had learned that his well-being did not come from within, but from a glass ampule. He had surrendered the autonomy of his body to a man who was eager to please, a man who would mix anything, try anything, to keep his master happy. The connection was made. The needle was in. And as the ambitions of the Reich grew from political maneuvering to global conquest, the vitamins would no longer be enough. The war was coming, and to fight it, the patient would need something much, much stronger. This escalation coincided with a sinister breakthrough in 1938. While the swastika flew from every government building in Berlin and the rhythm of jackboots on the cobblestones grew faster, Germany is rearming at a terrifying pace. But while the tanks roll off the assembly lines in the Ruhr Valley, a different kind of weapon is being forged in a pharmaceutical laboratory in the district of Adlershof. The company is called Temmler-Werke. The chemists there have been experimenting with a synthesized stimulant based on the American drug Benzedrine, but they have refined it, stripped it of its impurities, and potentiated its effects. They name it Pervitin. Today we know it by a different name, Crystal Meth. But in 1938, Pervitin is not a street drug sold in back alleys. It is a miracle of German science. It is perfectly legal. You can buy it in any pharmacy in Berlin without a prescription. The marketing campaign is aggressive and modern. It is sold as a mood elevator, a remedy for depression, a cure for sluggishness. Billboards declare it will help you integrate better into the community. Housekeepers take it to scrub floors with furious energy. Firemen take it to stay alert. It even comes in the form of boxed chocolates, Hildebrand chocolates, containing 14 milligrams of methamphetamine per box, marketed to housewives with the slogan, "Housework makes you happy in no time at all." This is the great deception of the pre-war years. The Nazis are publicly obsessed with health. They are sterilizing the mentally ill. They are preaching the sanctity of the Aryan bloodline. They are running the world's most aggressive anti-smoking campaign. Yet privately, the entire nation is being primed on a potent neurotoxin. Germany is waking up. But it is an artificial awakening, a chemical dawn. And as Adolf Hitler prepares to unleash his army on Europe, he finds that this little white pill is the perfect fuel for a new kind of warfare. When the Wehrmacht finally surged across the Polish border on September 1st, 1939, the world watched in horror as they smashed through the Polish defenses with a speed and ferocity never seen before in military history. They call it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The tactical explanation is the coordination of tanks and dive bombers, but the biological explanation is Pervitin. Dr. Otto Ranke, director of the Research Institute for Defense Physiology, realized early on that the Blitzkrieg faced a greater enemy than the Polish army: sleep. A tank driver who falls asleep stops the advance. A rifleman who is exhausted misses his target. Ranke tested Pervitin on university students and found they could work for 36 to 50 hours without rest, with no drop in performance, only a rising sense of invincibility. Ranke issued a decree. Pervitin was declared essential for the war effort. As the tanks rolled into Poland, the medical officers were not just handing out bandages, they were handing out meth. The instructions were cold and clinical: 1 tablet during the day, 2 at night if necessary. The results were terrifyingly effective. The German soldiers didn't stop. They didn't sleep. They fought with a robotic, wide-eyed intensity that terrified the Polish defenders. But the drug takes its toll. Soldiers began writing letters home that sound like the ramblings of lunatics. Heinrich Böll, who would later win the Nobel Prize for Literature, was a young soldier on the front. He wrote to his parents, "Dear parents, I am tough, but I am so tired. Please send me more Pervitin. It is the only thing that helps." The master race was begging for its fix, and the High Command answered. Before the invasion of France in 1940, the Wehrmacht ordered 35 million tablets of Pervitin for the Army and the Luftwaffe. The Panzer chocolate was distributed to tank crews. The pilots took it to fly longer sorties. The invasion of France through the Ardennes forest, a terrain considered impassable, was successful largely because the German armored columns drove for 3 days and 3 nights without stopping. The French commanders, operating on normal human sleep cycles, simply couldn't comprehend how the Germans were moving so fast. They thought they were fighting supermen. They were actually fighting meth heads. While the army was vibrating with energy, a conflict was brewing in the high offices of the Reich. Leonardo Conti, the Reich health leader, was a true believer in Nazi purity. He looked at the Pervitin usage and was horrified. He saw a nation of addicts. He saw the side effects: young soldiers suffering from heart failure, psychosis, and complete physical collapse after the drug wore off. Conti tried to ban Pervitin. He tried to restrict it, to make it prescription only, to classify it as a narcotic under the opium law. But he was fighting a losing battle. The war demanded speed. The generals loved the drug. And ultimately, the example was being set from the very top. How could Conti ban stimulants when the Führer himself was beginning his own chemical ascent? This highlights the central contradiction of the regime. The ideology demanded a clean body, but the survival of the regime required a dirty performance. They sacrificed their principles for the tactical advantage of the amphetamine high. The Volksdroge became the Panzer Schokolade, and the moral objection was swept away by the euphoria of victory. Paris fell in 6 weeks. Who cares about side effects when you are marching under the Arc de Triomphe? Back in the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler was fighting his own war against exhaustion. The workload of the Supreme Commander was crushing. He was micromanaging the invasions, giving speeches and holding court until 4 a.m. every night. The stress brought back his stomach cramps and his hysterical bloating. Theodore Morel was there, always hovering in the background with his black medical bag. The Mutaflor treatments were no longer enough. The simple glucose shots were too weak. Hitler needed something that matched the intensity of the war he had started. Morel introduced a new weapon, Vitamultine. On paper, Vitamultine was a harmless complex of vitamins. It was wrapped in gold foil, looking expensive and exclusive. Morel injected it intravenously. But here is where the forensic detective work becomes crucial. Diaries and chemical analyses of the leftover ampules suggest that Morel was spiking the mix. He wasn't just giving Hitler vitamins. He was adding Pervitin, caffeine, and sometimes small doses of metabolic stimulants. The effect on Hitler was immediate and profound. Before a major speech at the Sportpalast in Berlin, Hitler would be pale, slumped in a chair, complaining of faintness. Morel would administer the Vitamultine shot. Within minutes, the color would return to Hitler's cheeks. His eyes would brighten. He would stride out to the podium and scream for 2 hours with manic energy. Hitler didn't ask what was in the syringe. He didn't want to know. He practiced what psychologists call willful blindness. As long as Morel called it medicine or vitamins, Hitler could maintain his self-image as the ascetic teetotaler. He could look down on Goering for being a morphine addict, while he himself was having methamphetamine pumped directly into his veins. It was a symbiotic relationship of deceit. Morel lied about the contents, and Hitler lied to himself about the effects. The turning point for both the war and the addiction came in 1941. Hitler began planning Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the ideological endgame, the destruction of Jewish Bolshevism, and the seizure of Lebensraum in the East. The scale of the operation was insane. 3 million men, thousands of tanks, a front line stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The stress on Hitler was unimaginable. He became increasingly erratic, prone to fits of rage and sudden shifts in mood. To cope, Morel increased the frequency of the injections. The vitamin phase was effectively over. They were now in the stimulant phase. We see this in the change in Hitler's behavior. During the planning meetings in the spring of 1941, generals noted that Hitler was unusually optimistic, almost manic. He dismissed the reports on the size of the Red Army. He laughed at warnings about the Russian winter. He famously declared, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." This is the voice of amphetamine. Methamphetamine inflates the ego. It creates a tunnel vision where obstacles seem insignificant and one's own capabilities seem limitless. It removes the natural caution that a military commander needs. Hitler wasn't just underestimating the Russians because of his racist ideology. He was underestimating them because his brain was swimming in a chemical bath of dopamine and norepinephrine. On the morning of June 22, 1941, the invasion began. In the Wolf's Lair, his concrete bunker in the forests of East Prussia, Hitler fell ill. The pressure of the decision caused his body to revolt again. Dysentery, fever, nausea. He could barely stand. Morel went to work. He combined the Pervitin with something new, hormones. He began injecting Hitler with extracts of heart muscle, liver, and pancreas. The idea was to transfer the animal energy of the beast into the leader. It was medieval alchemy masquerading as modern medicine, and it worked temporarily. Hitler rose from his sickbed, energized, and took command of the greatest slaughter in human history. By late 1941, other doctors in Hitler's circle began to notice something was wrong. Dr. Karl Brandt and Dr. Hans Karl von Hasselbach, the reputable surgeons who traveled with the entourage, watched Morel with deep suspicion. They saw the needle marks on Hitler's arms. They saw the rapid mood swings, the way Hitler would go from a comatose slump to a manic tirade in the span of 10 minutes after a visit from Morel. They tried to intervene. They whispered to Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, that Morel was poisoning the Führer. They called Morel a criminal, but they misunderstood the dynamic. Hitler didn't want a doctor who would tell him to rest. He didn't want a doctor who warned him about long-term side effects. He wanted an enabler. When Brandt tried to caution Hitler about the unknown ingredients in Morel's injections, Hitler snapped, "Morel is the only one who understands me," he shouted. "He is the only one who can help me." This is the classic defense mechanism of the addict defending his dealer. Hitler needed Morel because Morel validated his delusion that he was superhuman. If he was just a man, he would need sleep. If he was just a man, he would feel pain. But with Morel's vitamins, he could transcend biology. He could be the Führer 24 hours a day. As 1941 drew to a close, the German advance halted at the gates of Moscow. The Russian winter descended. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees. The Pervitin in the soldiers' pockets froze. The machinery of the blitzkrieg ground to a halt. For the first time, the drug stopped working. The manic optimism of the summer crashed into the freezing reality of December. Hitler, holed up in the wolf's lair, faced a crisis. The news from the front was catastrophic. His generals wanted to retreat. Hitler refused. He issued his famous halt order. No retreat, not a single step back. Many historians credit this order with saving the German army from a rout like Napoleon's, but others point to the psychological rigidity behind it. Hitler was incapable of processing defeat. His chemically altered brain could not accept a reverse gear. Morel's diaries from this period show a spike in activity. Injection as usual, he writes day after day, but he also notes that Hitler's veins are becoming difficult to find. The skin is becoming tough, the arm is tender. The physical cost of the artificial energy is beginning to manifest. And there was another, more ominous development. As the stress mounted, Morel began to experiment with stronger substances to help Hitler sleep. The stimulants kept him awake, but then he couldn't turn off. So the cycle of uppers and downers began. Barbiturates for sleep, bromides for nerves, and then the morning shot to wake him up again. The chemical roller coaster was in motion, up and down, up and down. The man controlling the fate of Europe was no longer riding the wave of history. He was riding the peaks and troughs of his blood plasma concentration. The blitzkrieg phase was over. The war of attrition had begun. And for a war of attrition, vitamins and speed would not be enough. The pain was coming. And to treat the pain, Morel would have to unlock the cabinet of heavy narcotics. The opioids were waiting. This shift to heavier narcotics mirrored the regime's retreat from the open victories of the early war to the suffocating isolation of 1942, as the center of gravity moved away from the grand architecture of Berlin to the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, a complex of damp concrete bunkers hidden deep within the swampy forests of East Prussia. This relocation marked a critical psychological turning point for Adolf Hitler, effectively sealing him inside a tomb of his own making, where the air was thick with humidity, mosquitoes, and the stale odor of fear. For a man with a lifelong history of hypochondria and depressive episodes, this was the worst possible environment, a claustrophobic pressure cooker where he cut off all contact with the suffering German populace and the bombed-out cities to exist solely in a world of maps and medical charts. The atmosphere inside the bunker was surreal and toxic, with generals like Alfred Jodl and Wilhelm Keitel walking on eggshells to avoid triggering the Führer's explosive rages, while Theodor Morell became the most indispensable man in the compound. The water in the wolf's lair was contaminated and the food heavy, leading to a widespread reliance on Morell's treatments among the staff, but for patient A, the regimen was becoming a frantic, high-stakes attempt to hold back the physical collapse of a leader who was rapidly losing his grip on reality. The war had fundamentally turned with the entry of the United States and the stalling of the Eastern Front, and Hitler's body reacted to this shift with violent psychosomatic symptoms, fluctuating blood pressure, incessant ringing in the ears, and the early signs of a tremor in his left hand that would later define his final days. The defining tragedy of this era, the catastrophe at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943, must be understood not just as a military failure, but as a pharmacological one. When the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus was encircled, trapping 300,000 men in a cauldron of ice and starvation, the logical military solution was an immediate breakout and retreat. However, Hitler refused to authorize the withdrawal, issuing the infamous Festung Stalingrad order that condemned an entire army to death, a decision that historians often attribute to simple fanaticism, but which bears the unmistakable chemical signature of methamphetamine abuse. Morell's diaries from this period reveal a consistent pattern of injections containing glucose, vitamins, and stimulants administered before daily situation conferences, inducing a state of cognitive rigidity where the user becomes chemically incapable of adapting to new information or admitting error. The brain, flooded with artificial dopamine, locks onto a single idea with paranoid intensity, transforming strategic flexibility into perceived treason and retreat into cowardice. Hitler sat in his bunker, insulated by a drug-induced bubble of omnipotence, moving imaginary divisions on a map and convincing himself that non-existent relief forces would save the day. While in the freezing ruins of Stalingrad, his soldiers boiled leather boots for soup and died by the thousands. The drugs did not merely support his command, they severed the final link between the supreme commander and the grim reality of the battlefield, turning a tactical crisis into a grotesque theater of unnecessary death. As the relentless stress of the war ate away at Hitler's biological reserves, Morell realized that the standard cocktail of pervitin and vitamins was losing its potency due to the body's natural tolerance mechanisms. To achieve the same surge of energy required for Hitler to face his generals, Morell escalated the treatment into the realm of medieval alchemy, introducing orchicrin, a biological extract made from the testicles, seminal vesicles, and prostates of young bulls. In the pseudoscientific landscape of the Nazi medical world, this was believed to transfer the primal virility of the animal directly into the leader, a seductive promise for a dictator terrified of aging and losing his masculine dominance. Morell's experimentation grew increasingly bizarre as he began administering homosaran, a preparation derived from human placenta and extracts from the pituitary glands of pigs, essentially turning Hitler's bloodstream into a zoo of foreign proteins. From a modern medical perspective, this regimen was reckless insanity, carrying massive risks of allergic reactions and anaphylactic shock, which indeed manifested as severe hives and throat swelling that plagued Hitler throughout the year. Yet Hitler accepted these dangerous injections because they provided a temporary visceral surge of metabolic energy, a kick that allowed him to suppress his exhaustion and project the aggression necessary to intimidate his subordinates, effectively becoming addicted not just to the substance but to the artificial sensation of resurrection. The physical transformation of Adolf Hitler between 1940 and 1943 was shocking, a rapid acceleration of aging that saw a man in his late 40s wither into the appearance of a sexagenarian with graying hair, a pasty yellowed complexion indicating liver toxicity, and a permanent stoop. While the Nazi propaganda machine worked overtime to retouch photographs and edit newsreels to maintain the myth of the ageless Übermensch, the inner circle watched in horror as the Führer began to drag his left leg and succumb to digestive agonies that left him screaming in the night. The return of his severe stomach cramps following the Battle of Kursk led Morell to prescribe Dr. Köster's antigas pills, a common remedy that contained dangerous ingredients, including belladonna and, most critically, strychnine. Hitler consumed these pills in massive quantities, sometimes taking up to 16 a day, unknowingly accumulating a lethal neurotoxin in his system that causes symptoms such as sensitivity to light, rigidity of the limbs, and extreme irritability. In a twist of cruel irony, the pills he took to settle his stomach were slowly destroying his nervous system. It is highly probable that the legendary rages of this period, the foaming at the mouth, and the inability to tolerate bright lights in the bunker, were exacerbated by mild strychnine poisoning, creating a vicious cycle where he poisoned himself to cure the side effects of the drugs he took to cure the stress of the war. By the end of 1943, the psychological profile of the dictator had shifted entirely from the manic conqueror of the early war to a paranoid victim who saw treachery in every shadow. The chronic abuse of amphetamines had eroded the inhibitory control mechanisms of his frontal cortex, fueling a deep, chemically amplified mistrust of the Wehrmacht generals whom he believed were sabotaging his genius. This paranoia created a self-destructive feedback loop where he refused to delegate, attempting to micromanage every battalion on the Eastern Front from his desk, which in turn increased his exhaustion and his dependence on Morell's needle. As the Allies bombed German cities into ash and the Soviets pushed across the Dnieper, Hitler was reduced to a physical wreck, kept functioning only by a dizzying regimen of uppers to wake up, hormones to feel virile, strychnine to digest, and barbiturates to sleep. The high of the early war was long gone, replaced by a desperate, sweating struggle to maintain a facade of normalcy, while the pain of his deteriorating body and the crumbling front lines closed in on him. This was the end of the stimulant phase and the beginning of the final darkest chapter, where the exhaustion would become so profound that only the heavy narcotics, the opioids, would be able to numb the agony of the impending collapse. The trajectory of Adolf Hitler's addiction and the fate of the Second World War changed irrevocably at 12:42 p.m. on July 20th, 1944. Inside the briefing hut at the Wolf's Lair, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a briefcase containing 1 kilogram of plastic explosives under the heavy oak map table just feet away from the Führer before slipping out of the room. When the bomb detonated, the blast tore through the wooden structure, shattering the windows, collapsing the roof, and killing 4 officers instantly. Hitler, shielded by the thick leg of the table, survived the inferno, but the physical impact on his already deteriorating body was catastrophic. His clothes were shredded, his back was peppered with hundreds of oak splinters, his right arm was temporarily paralyzed, and most critically, both of his eardrums were ruptured, leaving him bleeding from the ears and deafened by a constant, agonizing ringing. While the propaganda machine immediately spun his survival as an act of divine providence, creating a myth of invincibility that would briefly rally the nation, the biological reality was that the explosion had shattered the dictator's nervous system, creating a level of chronic pain that the old regimen of vitamins and hormones could no longer touch. In the chaotic hours following the assassination attempt, Theodor Morell faced a crisis that required a pharmacological escalation of the highest order. With Hitler writhing in pain from his perforated eardrums and the multiple contusions covering his legs, Morell reached into his black bag and withdrew a drug that would define the final zombie-like phase of the Third Reich, Eukodal. Chemically known as oxycodone, Eukodal was a synthetic opioid synthesized from the bane, a constituent of opium, but it was engineered to be roughly twice as potent as morphine and possessed a unique, terrifying characteristic, a high potential for inducing severe euphoria. Unlike morphine, which simply dulls pain and induces sleep, Eukodal has a speedball effect on some patients, creating a sensation of immense well-being, boundless capability, and a warm, detached serenity that wipes away not just physical agony, but psychological distress. When Morell administered the first injections of Eukodal in the aftermath of the bombing, he did not just treat a patient, he created a junkie, locking Hitler's brain into a cycle of opioid dependence that would insulate him from the collapsing fronts of the war. The immediate psychological impact of the Eukodal was visible to everyone who encountered Hitler on the afternoon of July 20th. Just hours after being blown up, with his hair singed and his hearing shattered, Hitler went to the train station to greet Benito Mussolini, whose train was arriving at the Wolf's Lair. Observers expected to see a broken, shaken man, but instead, they witnessed a spectacle of manic energy and bizarre calmness. Hitler embraced Mussolini with his good arm and launched into an incessant, euphoric monologue about his survival, claiming that he was immortal and that fate had spared him to complete his great work. This was not the natural reaction of a man suffering from severe shock and blast trauma. It was the chemically induced confidence of a powerful opioid flooding the receptors of the brain. The Eukodal had stripped away the fear and the pain, replacing them with a golden haze of invulnerability, allowing Hitler to ignore the treason of his own officers and the approaching Soviet army, reinforcing his delusion that he was the chosen instrument of destiny. As if the opioids were not enough, the medical drama at the Wolf's Lair deepened with the arrival of Dr. Erwin Giesing, an ear, nose, and throat specialist brought in to treat Hitler's ruptured eardrums and his chronic sinus problems. Giesing was a man of traditional medicine who despised Morell, yet he inadvertently introduced the second component of the lethal cocktail that would grip Hitler in late 1944, cocaine. To treat the severe swelling in Hitler's nasal passages and to anesthetize the pain in his ears, Giesing prescribed a 10% solution of cocaine, an incredibly potent concentration, to be swabbed directly onto the mucous membranes. Hitler's reaction to the drug was immediate and enthusiastic. He told Giesing that the cocaine made his head feel crystal clear and relieved the terrible pressure in his sinuses, demanding that the doctor apply the solution multiple times a day. Soon, Hitler was essentially self-medicating, requesting the treatment not for medical necessity but for the mental clarity and sharpness it provided, effectively balancing the sedative effects of the Eukodal with the sharp nervous stimulation of the cocaine. By September 1944, the atmosphere inside the Führer's inner circle had devolved into a vicious medical civil war, mirroring the chaotic disintegration of the regime itself. Dr. Giesing and the other SS surgeons, alarmed by Hitler's gray skin and erratic behavior, began to investigate Morell's treatments, eventually stealing samples of the Dr. Küster's Antigas pills that Hitler was swallowing by the handful. When Giesing analyzed the pills and discovered they contained strychnine and atropine, he believed he had found the smoking gun to destroy Morell, calculating that Hitler was slowly being poisoned by his own physician. Giesing presented his findings to Hitler, expecting the dictator to be outraged, but the reaction was a stunning display of the psychology of addiction. Hitler dismissed the evidence, furiously defending Morell and claiming that he himself had demanded the pills because they were the only thing that worked, ultimately firing Giesing and the other critics. He chose the dealer over the doctor, effectively severing the last link to responsible medical care and isolating himself entirely with Morell, the only man who would continue to feed his insatiable need for the syringe. As the winter of 1944 approached, Hitler had fully entered a state of polytoxicomania, a medical term describing the addiction to a combination of multiple psychoactive substances. His daily routine had become a terrifying chemical balancing act. Pervitin and cocaine to wake him up and provide the aggressive energy needed for the daily briefings. Eukodal to numb the chronic pain and the psychological crushing weight of defeat, and heavy barbiturates to knock him unconscious when the insomnia became unbearable. This cocktail destroyed his natural sleep-wake cycle and his ability to regulate emotion, resulting in the infamous map room rages where he would lose all control, screaming until his voice broke, only to collapse into a lethargic stupor minutes later as the drugs wore off or kicked in. The trembling in his left hand became violent and constant, no longer a subtle flutter, but a rhythmic thrashing that he had to physically restrain, a symptom that was likely a combination of advancing Parkinson's disease and the chronic neurotoxicity of the stimulants he had been abusing for years. It is through this lens of opioid detachment and stimulant-induced grandeur that we must view the military decisions of late 1944, specifically the planning of the Ardennes offensive or the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was a fantasy, a massive armored strike through the snow-covered forests of Belgium to capture the port of Antwerp and split the Allied armies, a goal that every rational general knew was impossible due to the lack of fuel and air cover. Yet Hitler, insulated by the Eukodal, which suppressed anxiety, and the cocaine, which induced a feeling of mental sharpness, overruled all objections with a dreamy glazed certainty, convinced that his will alone could alter the laws of logistics. He was gambling the last reserves of the Wehrmacht, the final scraps of Germany's military power, on a delusion fueled by a brain that was no longer operating in the real world. The orders were drafted in the dead of night, often after a fresh injection, sending hundreds of thousands of men into a meat grinder that would achieve nothing but the acceleration of the inevitable end. The tragedy of the winter of 1944 was not just a strategic failure. It was the hallucination of a junkie projected onto the map of Europe, paid for in blood. By January 1945, the manic euphoria that had fueled the planning of the Ardennes offensive had evaporated, replaced by a crushing toxic hangover that mirrored the military collapse on the Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge had failed, burning through the last fuel reserves in the final armored divisions of the Reich, leaving the road to the Rhine wide open for the Allies. Hitler, forced to abandon his headquarters in the West and retreat to Berlin, was no longer the energized tactician who had embraced Mussolini months earlier. He was a broken husk, physically ravaged by the frantic cocktail of cocaine and Eukodal that had sustained his delusions of victory. The train journey back to the capital was a funeral procession for his sanity, marking the end of his movement above ground and the beginning of his final entombment. As he descended into the Führer bunker, the subterranean concrete labyrinth beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, he brought with him not only the shattered remnants of his government, but also a body that was rapidly shutting down under the accumulated toxicity of 9 years of chemical abuse. The bunker itself, with its humming diesel generators, stale recycled air, and artificial light, became a perfect physical metaphor for his addiction. A sealed, suffocating environment cut off from the natural world, where day and night lost all meaning, and reality was synthesized by maps and syringes. The medical records from the first months of 1945 present a gruesome picture of physical disintegration that the Nazi propaganda machine desperately tried to hide. Theodor Morell's diaries from this period become a chronicle of desperation, noting with clinical frustration that the Führer's veins were completely ruined. After years of daily, sometimes hourly, intravenous injections, the blood vessels in Hitler's arms had collapsed, hardened by scar tissue and inflammation, a condition known as thrombophlebitis. Morell frequently spent agonizing minutes prodding the arms of the dictator, searching for a patch of healthy vessel that would accept the needle, often failing and leaving bloody hematomas in his wake. When the veins finally became inaccessible, Morell was forced to switch to intramuscular injections, thrusting the needle directly into the gluteal muscles or the thighs. But the frequency of these shots led to the formation of painful, weeping abscesses. Hitler was essentially rotting alive, his skin turning a sickly, papery gray, his body covered in sores and puncture marks. Yet he continued to demand the shots, screaming at Morell to find a way to get the chemicals into his system because he could no longer face a single hour of consciousness without them. It is in this phase of polytoxicomania that we must confront the darkest question of his psychological state, the relationship between his drug use and the ongoing machinery of the Holocaust. While the extermination camps had been operating for years based on his ideological directives, the frenzied acceleration of the killing in the final months of the war coincided with Hitler's deepest immersion in opioid sedation. Eukodal does not make a man a murderer. Hitler was that long before the drugs took hold, but it creates a profound state of emotional numbing and detachment, a pharmacological wall that separates the user from the consequences of their actions. As the reports of the advancing Soviet army, revealing the horrors of Majdanek and Auschwitz, began to filter back to Berlin, Hitler remained in a strange drug-induced twilight, chemically insulated from any potential pang of guilt or horror. The drugs allowed him to sign orders condemning thousands to death and to demand the scorched earth destruction of German infrastructure, with the mechanical indifference of a bureaucrat filing paperwork. He was not a madman raging against the dying of the light. He was a sedated monster, watching the apocalypse through the cloudy lens of an opioid haze, incapable of empathy, because his neural pathways for processing human suffering were drowned in synthetic alkaloids. Compounding the drug-induced decay was the unmistakable progression of a neurological disorder that had been lurking in the background, Parkinson's disease. By February 1945, the tremor in Hitler's left hand had become so violent that he could no longer hold a document steady, forcing him to keep the hand jammed into his pocket or gripped tightly behind his back during the few brief appearances he made. While some historians argue that the shaking was solely a symptom of withdrawal or stimulant abuse, the specific rhythmic nature of the tremor, a pill-rolling motion of the thumb and forefinger, strongly suggests genuine Parkinsonism. However, the tragedy of his treatment lies in the fact that Morell, either through incompetence or fear, refused to diagnose it as a degenerative disease, instead treating the symptoms with yet more stimulants, believing the shaking was a sign of fatigue that could be cured with Pervitin. This was adding gasoline to a fire. The methamphetamines likely exacerbated the tremors, sending the dictator's motor control into chaotic overdrive, while his brain remained trapped in a rigid, dopamine-starved loop. He shuffled through the corridors of the bunker with a stooped back and dragging feet, a prematurely senile wreck of 55 who looked 80, drooling uncontrollably from the corners of his mouth, a grotesque figure of pitiable weakness who still held the power to drag the entire world down into the grave with him. The final horrifying symptom that manifested in the claustrophobia of the bunker was dermatillomania, a compulsive skin-picking disorder often associated with chronic methamphetamine psychosis and extreme anxiety. Witnesses in the bunker, including his secretaries and aides, observed Hitler obsessively picking at the skin on his neck and face, scratching at imaginary irritations until he drew blood. This behavior, known as formication, is a classic hallucination of the meth addict, the sensation of insects crawling beneath the skin, a tactile delusion that drives the sufferer to tear at their own flesh in a desperate attempt to remove the phantom parasites. It was a visceral manifestation of his internal corruption. The man who had obsessed over the purity of the Aryan race was now literally tearing himself apart, clawing at his own skin as if trying to escape the rotting vessel of his body. In these moments, huddled in the damp concrete room, picking at his scabs and waiting for Morell's next injection, the Führer ceased to exist, replaced by a trembling, paranoid addict trapped in the terminal stage of a self-inflicted medical disaster. As March 1945 dragged on, the situation reached a breaking point not just militarily, but logistically. The final act of the Third Reich's pharmacological tragedy began hundreds of miles away, in the industrial city of Darmstadt. In the dying weeks of the war, Royal Air Force bombers conducted a series of devastating raids that reduced the Merck pharmaceutical complex to rubble. This was the beating heart of Germany's Eukodal and Pervitin production, the logistical umbilical cord that had kept the Wehrmacht marching and the Führer functioning. When the news of the factory's destruction reached Berlin, it signaled a catastrophe far more personal to Hitler than the loss of a division or a city. The supply lines were severed. The stockpiles in the bunker's medical cabinet were dwindling to critical levels, and the chaotic state of the encircled capital meant that no fresh shipments could get through the Soviet ring of steel. For the first time in 9 years, Adolf Hitler faced a terror that transcended the political or military collapse. He was facing the absolute biological inevitability of cold turkey withdrawal in the middle of an apocalypse. The man who had commanded the destruction of Europe was about to be left alone with his own unmedicated brain, stripped of the chemical armor that had shielded him from the reality of his crimes and his failure. By mid-April 1945, the atmosphere inside the Führer bunker had become a claustrophobic nightmare of vibrating concrete and stale fear, punctuated by the dull thud of Soviet artillery shells impacting the Chancellery Gardens above. In this subterranean tomb, Hitler was reduced to a wretched, trembling specter, a physical manifestation of a crash, so severe it defies simple medical categorization. With the Eukodal gone and the Pervitin rationed to crumbs, the masking effects of the opioids vanished, unleashing the full fury of his ruined nervous system. The tremor in his left hand evolved from a rhythmic shake into a violent, flailing spasm that he had to physically pin against his side to conceal, while his posture collapsed into a painful, permanent stoop. This was the withdrawal syndrome in its rawest form. The sweating, the unbearable aches in the bones, the hypersensitivity to light and sound, and the profound dysphoria that makes existence itself feel like a punishment. Yet even in this state there was no clarity. The absence of the drugs did not bring sobriety, but rather a jagged, raw paranoia. The superhuman facade had completely eroded, leaving behind a shivering, drooling wreck who shuffled through the corridors, screaming at phantom betrayals while his body screamed for the needle that would never come. The relationship between the dictator and his dealer, which had survived the skepticism of generals and the intrigues of the SS, finally imploded on April 21st, 1945. The end came not with a whimper, but with a paranoid explosion that perfectly encapsulated the psychosis of the final days. Theodore Morell, the faithful enabler who had stuck by his patient A when all others had fled or been fired, approached Hitler with a syringe containing a simple dose of glucose and caffeine, attempting to revive the lethargic leader. But in the twisted logic of Hitler's withdrawal-riddled mind, this act of care was interpreted as an assassination attempt. Hitler flew into a rage, screaming that Morell was trying to inject him with morphine to sedate him, render him unconscious, and smuggle him out of Berlin like a piece of luggage to be handed over to the Russians. "You want to drug me," he shouted, a supreme irony for a man who had lived on drugs for a decade. He stripped Morell of his rank and ordered him to leave the bunker immediately. The Reich injection master, the man who had held the keys to the Führer's biology, was cast out into the burning ruins of Berlin, clutching his heart, terrified and weeping, dismissed by the very addict he had created. With Morell gone and the chemical cupboard bare, Hitler spent his final week in a state of grim, unmediated fatalism. He was attended to by Dr. Werner Hasse and a nurse, Erna Flegel, who managed to scrounge up only basic medications, leaving the dictator to face the end with a clarity that was likely more terrifying than the intoxication. On April 30th, 1945, with the Red Army troops just a few hundred meters away at the Potsdamer Platz, Adolf Hitler administered his final medical treatment. It was not a stimulant to prolong the fight, nor an opioid to numb the pain. It was a capsule of cyanide, tested moments earlier on his beloved dog Blondie to ensure its potency, followed immediately by a bullet to the right temple. The cyanide broke the cellular respiratory chain, halting the chemical processes of life instantly. A fitting end for a man who had tried to chemically engineer his own reality. The 1,000-year Reich ended not with a bang of glory, but with the crunch of a glass vial and the silence of a stopped heart in a dirty, fuel-stained sofa. The fate of Theodore Morell serves as a pathetic postscript to this tragedy. After fleeing the bunker, he wandered through the ruins until he was captured by American forces. He expected to be treated as a person of historical importance, perhaps even respected as the physician to a head of state. Instead, his American captors were disgusted by him. They found him obese, unkempt, and smelling foul, weeping constantly about his lost medical records. During his interrogation, Morell was bewildered by the accusation that he was a war criminal. He insisted he was just a doctor who treated a patient's symptoms. "I only did what he asked," he pleaded. He was never prosecuted for war crimes because the Allies concluded he was not an ideologue, but merely a grossly incompetent opportunist who had accidentally hastened the end of the war by poisoning the enemy leader. He died in a hospital in Tegernsee in 1948, shortly after his release from internment, penniless, mentally broken, and reviled by both the survivors of the regime and its conquerors, the forgotten dealer of the devil. Rendering a verdict on this grotesque history requires looking beyond the individual addict. The story of Hitler's drugs is not an exoneration. It does not absolve him of the Holocaust or the war. The hatred, the anti-Semitism, and the lust for power were innate to his character, present long before the first needle pricked his skin. The drugs did not create the monster, they merely uncaged him, removing the biological brakes of empathy, caution, and fatigue that limit normal human behavior. But the legacy of this addiction extends far beyond the bunker. It is the story of a regime that preached purity while running on poison. It is the story of 35 million Pervitin pills fed to young German soldiers, turning a generation into chemically dependent machines of war. The Third Reich was, in its very bloodstream, a doping scandal on a continental scale, a system that believed it could conquer the world by conquering the limitations of the human body with synthetic alkaloids. When the smoke clears over the ruins of Berlin, the image that remains is not the triumph of the will, but the trembling of the hand. It is the image of a leader who demanded absolute strength from his people while being unable to stand without a cocktail of bull testicles and narcotics coursing through his veins. It serves as an eternal, terrifying warning about the nature of absolute power. Placing the fate of nations in the hands of a single individual means placing it at the mercy of their biology, their neurology, and their chemical stability. Adolf Hitler wanted to be a god, an Übermensch above the laws of nature. But in the end, as he sat shivering in the dark, picking at his own skin and terrified of the silence, he was revealed to be the most fragile thing of all, a broken, sick, and desperate man, dying by the very chemistry he thought he had mastered